Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our INL supplier webinar series. We were having a little bit of technical difficulty on our side, so we have all presenters online now, and we are ready to go. So today we're going to talk about the energy supply chain and supply chains in general, and we have three experts with us who are passionate about this topic. Our first presenter is going to be Amy Lentz. And Amy is an executive with the Idaho National Laboratory, and she is responsible for the supply chain for the growing energy industry. In this role, she leads efforts to develop regional strategies to fill future energy workforce needs and lead programs to connect energy to future business opportunities. She also coordinates opportunities and actions that create sustainable energy-related businesses that cater to both regional and global needs. She connects the dots and leads partnerships to affect change between energy project leads, economic development agencies, education institutions, regional commerce organizations, and government affairs and procurement teams. So Amy is a very busy person. We also have with us Mark Bronson, and Mark has an MBA from Utah State University, Huntsman School of Business, and he's a certified supply chain professional. Mark has been living supply chain his entire life, I think. He's also he also has a PMP, a project management professional with the Project Management Institution, and he holds a certificate in supply chain management from ASCM, along with supply chain operations reference professional training. See, I told you he's way into this supply chain. Mark has spent his whole career working to instill excellence in the supply chain, starting early on with WordPerfect. How's that for a throwback? With Pepperidge Farms, and then eventually he moved to INL and is at the Specific Manufacturing Capability Project as a manager in planning and inventory control. And he currently is the SMC Material Department scheduling activities and manages the purchasing up there at that project. Then our final presenter is Barbara Siciliano. Barbara is retired from U.S. Federal Service after a 29-year career with the CIA. And she was in the Directorate of Operations of Clandestine Service. Upon her retirement, she was awarded the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, a rare and coveted medal awarded to only the highly accomplished senior intelligence service executive leaders. She served 12 years abroad supporting national security missions, as well as in key leadership positions in Washington, D.C. She is currently serving Idaho National Laboratory in the Senior Advisory Strategic Intelligence role. So welcome to all of our presenters. I did post their full bios on the webinar schedule, so if you have more interest in reading more about them, their bios are posted out there. And with that, we're going to go on ahead and get started. Amy, I'm going to kick it over to you, and I will be running the slides, so just let me know when you want me to go to the next one, and we'll get started.
Hi, everybody. Good morning out there, wherever you might be calling and dialing in from. I'm grateful for the opportunity that Stacy has afforded us today to talk to you a little bit about not only what we're doing at INL on a supply chain program and building that to make sure we're going down the right direction, but also I love these industry seminars that she does because it's educational, and that's also the point. And you're going to hear after me about what's going on at INL. You're going to hear from Mark, and he's going to talk to you more about supply chain risk management, and that's the educational part. Then we're going to flip it over to Barb, and Barb's going to talk to you specifically about how come this is so important in this day and age. And there's a connection, of course, to INL, who, you know, we lead the U.S. in nuclear energy research alongside with all of the work that we're doing in national homeland security. Then, of course, we'll come back to some questions, and we're looking forward to hopefully some further engagement with all of you that are out there. So I'll kick it off here by, let's look at this picture. This is a crazy picture here on the front page, or on the first slide that we have. I'll just say that one of the things that we have learned from others out there in the energy world is that the supply chain world is a complex and challenging effort for sure. And where we are in this picture is at Plant Vogtle. This is the first large nuclear reactor construction project that's been conducted in a very long time. And I hosted a group of individuals from our community and our state to actually go benchmark with Plant Vogtle down in Georgia. Everybody from the mayor to Idaho Falls Power, to our education leaders, to our commerce folks, to our workforce development folks, for them to meet their peers, to talk to the plant folks, but also to meet the community leaders, because it was very eye-opening in terms of what is required in terms of new construction. And this is the area that we are entering into right now. So if you don't mind, Stacy, can you flip to the next slide? There's always a pause, I think, sometimes. I call this is our wake up slide. This is our wake up to action slide. And if anybody tuned in yesterday to some great news, DOE just awarded 2 more additional contracts to deploy additional advanced reactor technologies. But this is my timeline slide, and it really was a wake up call. We really started looking forward at all of the different types of construction projects and new technologies that we're bringing onto the INL site. And I say INL site because there are a lot of contractors on the INL site. It's not just about Idaho National Laboratory, managed by Battelle Energy Alliance. We have the Naval Reactors Facility. And in this slide, you'll see that they have entered into some incredible construction projects right now for 2 big projects. The Naval Spent Handling Facility and the Cask Shipping and Receiving Facility will come soon. So the Navy is on the site. We also have other tenants that want to come and deploy potentially reactors on our site, both in the micro reactor area, which is hopefully maybe the first ones out of the gate, will be micro reactors here soon. And then many of you maybe have heard about the versatile test reactor. And this is a reactor that will start hopefully some construction work in 2026. And then we have the demonstrations that we will continue to do at Idaho National Laboratory. And then the small modular reactor, which is the new scale technology that UAMPS is leading. So if you look at this timeline and you start stacking all of the workforce needs, the supplier needs, and all the goods and services that will be acquired at the Idaho National Laboratory site, it truly did become our wake-up call to make sure we took some action. So Stacy, can you take the next slide, please? So we started really paying attention to what do we need to focus on? What do we need to do next? We put it into 2 buckets. We put it in the workforce bucket, and then we put it in our goods and services bucket. And we had to talk about the workforce right out of the gate because we recognized not only are we needing to do construction at an Idaho National Laboratory site, but Idaho is one of the fastest growing states in the country. So we also wanted to make sure our whole community was ready for all of the construction needs that we needed. But we also understood we had projections to look at. And although this is important to our own workforce, it's also important to every one of our suppliers and our vendors, whether they're local or regional, or whether they're also coming in from other locations. So workforce became a critical component for us to understand the supply chain needs. And then of course, there's the goods and services sides, really understanding the inventory needs, the challenges that we have today, so it'll help us get things cleared out tomorrow, but also really understanding what's available to us currently and how can we use what's available to us and where are the gaps. So next slide. So I just wanted to take a snapshot look at what we've done so far in this last year after we launched the supply chain initiative. We have done workforce projections, and they're completed for our future workforce needs, and we're also done with our construction workforce projections. This information's been combined with the other contractors on the site, and we're in the process of getting that ready to share with other people. So that will be very informative. We have information posted on our website, what is publicly available. We have a new supply chain section near and adjacent to Stacy Francis's vendor portal area. We also use this information to help educate our education. We use this information to educate our educators. They needed information so they could make smart strategic decisions on where their investments were, what kind of faculty they needed, what kind of equipment they needed to train people, how to recruit the right people. So this has been an ongoing, exciting dialogue to have with our education community. We've also understood how much we needed to increase our apprenticeships. It was really important, and we're a participant with some statewide efforts that we think will have tremendous payoffs to us in the future. We also held hands with our other contractors on the site, the Navy, as I mentioned, UAMPS, NewScale, to make sure we understood the big picture of what the needs were. So we weren't all competing for the same thing, but we're more looking at this, how can we work together? And then nationally, it was so important for us to understand from our partners, whether it was NEI, ANS, some of the contractor associations, just to understand what their challenges are and how can we work together to learn from them. On the right, you'll see some of the numbers that I showed here in terms of the INL. That's just us. That's not everybody else. So you can imagine how many other employees that we need. But we are really looking all together of adding about 4,000 additional jobs for INL and other that's just the nuclear need of what we're talking about. So let's go to the next slide. And as Stacy's doing that, before we talk about this, real quick, we also launched, and this was a result of our Plant Vogel trip, we launched a couple other task forces. We had to understand our housing challenges. We had to understand our transportation challenges. We wanted to make sure we understood really how can we collectively work together to do training programs. And so we've launched other subcommittees that I think are going to be incredibly insightful and helpful for us to work together as a coalition. On the business side of the house, we did do an inventory of the available local energy suppliers, both in Idaho and in Utah. That's kind of our regional supply chain. That doesn't mean we don't get our supplies from all over the country. We get them from all over the world, quite frankly. And we also had launched a couple other energy suppliers roundtables, one with the state, and also we have entered into discussions with national organizations as well. So we've also posted and provided growing business or developed Idaho's Growing Energy Guide, and we did this with Commerce, the state Commerce Department. You'll find that on our supply chain website alongside on Idaho Commerce's website, and that's really helpful for what grants are available, what's the availability of workforce, other tools and resources that are out there. So I posted here the link where you can find that guide. And we're in the process of still benchmarking. We're learning every day what those gaps are, what are going to be the challenge points in a new energy world, and where are we going to have challenges with buying goods and services. So next slide. And there's a few ends. We're still uncovering what those supply chain challenges are. Our versatile test reactor project, for example, is still in the design phase, and every day they're at work, they're learning about where some of those additional challenges might be. We're working closely with the National Reactor Innovation Center, and they're in the place where they can really look broadly at what the national challenges are in nuclear. So we're working with them to understand where those gaps are and how can we fix those problems so we're better prepared for tomorrow. And then today, and I'm done talking for now anyway, we want to talk to you about supply chain risk management. It's such a critical item for us, and it's so important that our suppliers and our vendors understand what these challenges are so we can be better partners. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide and we'll kick off Mark Bronson, who's on the phone. So Mark, we're all to you now.
Thanks, Amy. Everything that Amy showed, all those collaborations and everything going on with industry and all the contacts with government, she's done that basically from scratch. So she has this gargantuan task of getting Idaho and the nation back on track with a nuclear and energy supply chain. So she's doing a great job. She's working her tail off. I want to add to the wake up that she was proposing with all those projects coming. I want to give a wake up to supply chain risk management. I want to do that with some surprising statistics. The Institute for Supply Management reported from a July 2020 survey, so this summer, they reported that 97% of businesses have been or will be impacted by COVID-19. That's pretty much everybody, right? And we saw what happened with COVID. It basically kicked our butt nationwide and in the world in our supply chains. So 97% of businesses impacted. At least 44% of companies had no plan to deal with that. 61% companies say they are at least going to have a 35% reduction in revenue targets on average. So some other information from Deloitte. Over 200 of the global Fortune 500 companies have a presence in Wuhan. If you remember, Wuhan is where COVID started, right? So over 200 of the global Fortune 500 companies have a presence there. Deloitte also reported that the most optimistic of reports on conditions in China approaching normalcy is by April. That's the most optimistic. And looking at everything that's happened and where we're at, I doubt that's going to happen by April. So the effects of the supply chain disruption from COVID-19 are going to be felt for years. Think about the food industry, how many years it took to get to where the supply and demand was basically even, and it was in equilibrium, right? Before COVID hit, roughly 1/2 of the food supply was going directly to consumers in grocery and things like that. And the other half was going to food service, restaurants, and similar things. Supply was just meeting the demand. Well, when COVID hit, the demand went to about 75% direct to consumer and 25% to food service. But if you think about that, all this food was in the pipeline, in packaging, in distribution. All of a sudden that halted, and it's not like you can take food that's packed in bulk for restaurants and switch that and send that to grocery stores for consumers, right? So there was a lot of waste, and there was a lot of things that people were caught unawares. And how many of those companies in the food industry are going to go out of business in the meantime? So even if COVID went away tomorrow, it would still take time to get businesses up and running and the supply pipeline to fill again, to match kind of where they were, right? All industries had similar kind of disruptions. So in a 2018 report from insurancenewsnet.com, they reported that 20% of companies that have a supply chain disruption go out of business within 18 months. That's 1/5. So if the numbers are correct, that almost everybody was impacted by COVID, and 20% of companies have a supply chain disruption, are we going to see 1/5 of companies going out of business everywhere? It'll be interesting. So hopefully this gives us impact and shows us, hey, we need to be aware of supply chain risk management and we need to have plans in place. So how can your company be prepared for supply chain disruptions and minimize their effects? Be agile, be resilient, like companies like Lockheed Martin, Lego, Intuit, Honeywell? The short answer is do what mature supply chain risk organizations do. So let's talk about risk for a minute. Risk is basically the variety of possible events and their outcomes that could have a negative effect on the flow of goods, services, funds, and information. And that results in some level of quantitative or qualitative loss or gain for the supply chain. Sorry, Stacy, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So risk stems basically from a lack of full and timely information, and it also from a lack of control. So if we can bring certainty, if we can bring full and timely information, and we can bring control, that's going to help solve the problems that come with supply chain risks. For our discussion today, we've broken out supply chain risk into two categories. First is traditional supply chain risk, and the other is national security risk, supply chain risk, national security supply chain risk, which Barbara's going to talk about. Okay, next slide, please. So the traditional supply chain risk, that deals with goods and services, right, and that flow. And those kind of risks are things like pandemics, weather events, social unrest, market conditions, supplier problems of all kinds, financial instability. It's basically things that disrupt that supply flow. Next slide, please. So national security supply chain risk, that's two different kinds. First, the information technology, which is like networks, internet, single users, computers that run day-to-day operations, things like that. So some of those threats are in hardware, in software. There's hacking, spying, malware, ransomware, intellectual theft, other important information collection. The other area of national security risk is operational technology. Those are systems that control and run electrical grids, nuclear reactors, centrifuges, dams. All that stuff is really old technology, and there's vulnerabilities there. And again, Barbara's going to talk more about that. Next slide, please, Stacy. So I want to tell a story about that little guy down on the bottom right of the screen, the gold-winged warbler. That bird has a built-in mechanism so that when tornadoes are coming, 2 days before a tornado hits, it senses it and they all leave. So how can we get that kind of early warning system and early information so that we can be prepared to make moves like the gold-winged warbler does? Next slide, please. In 2020, we've already seen disruptions in the supply chain from a pandemic, severe weather events, social protests, and fires. Another scary bit of information came from a company called Resolink. The week of October 2nd, so just a few weeks ago, during 1 week there were 191 supply chain disruption events in the following categories: airport disruption, business sale, business spinoff, chemical spill, compliance issue, corporate restructuring, cyber attack, extreme weather, factory disruption, factory fire, force majeure, forest fire, geopolitical, human health, like COVID, right? Labor disruption, leadership transition, legal action, mine shutdown, merger and acquisition, port disruption, power outage, recall, regulatory change. Okay, so there's a lot of things to be prepared for. Let's just dive a little deeper into the COVID-19. That hit us hard, and for many of us, it was unexpected. The timeline, there were some early indicators there. December 27th or 28th, again, this company Resolink, next slide, please, Stacy. So Resolink on December 27th or 28th, they are a supply chain risk consulting company. They received word of a possible Wuhan shutdown because of some kind of unknown sickness, and they informed their clients on January 4th. Also, the end of January, there is a supply chain training with health industry suppliers. The trainer for that, as part of the training, they asked the trainer asked the companies to check their suppliers' for the impact of this sickness and shutdown that was happening in China. What they found kind of surprised them, and they kind of scratched their head for a minute. Their suppliers were asking where they could get face masks. So that was an early indication there was a face mask shortage in China. So what if there was better supply chain risk planning there? Also in April, Vox.com reported there was a shortage of N95 masks, and this caused healthcare workers to disregard basic coronavirus infection control. So they were working at risk, big risk, and a lot of people contracted the virus, and many got really sick, and a few died. March, there was a similar report in the New York Times for areas and companies around New York. So can we imagine if we were trying to do radiological work without our PPE, right? That we wouldn't think of that. That's unheard of. So would 2 to 3 months earlier warning have helped in total the response to these shutdowns? Could pre-planning have helped the response? Can your company respond to another worse shutdown? Because supply chain risk companies are talking about us being in a second wave of COVID right now. Last week, the news reported it took 2 years for the Spanish flu to subside and things to get back to near normal. So we might not be close to getting through all this. It might take some time. Next slide, please, Stacy. So the goal here is to optimally minimize supply chain risk exposure so you can be excellent as you seek your greatest reward from your people, your assets, your capabilities, and your resources. So what is resiliency? How can we put that into our supply chains and make them excellent? Gartner defined resiliency as having good visibility and the ability to shift sourcing, production, and distribution quickly when a disruption occurs. Okay, so kind of like that gold-winged warbler. Gartner also said, to find balance, supply chain leaders must engage in risk management to assess their organization's willingness to take risk on board and decide how to quantify that risk against other network objectives such as cost effectiveness. Here's another reason why to put resilience in. The Risk and Insurance Management Society did a 5-year study. From that 5-year study, they realized that organizations with a mature risk management practices realize a valuation premium of 25%. So next slide, please, Stacy. Beyond that, the process of integrating supply chain risk management improves relationships. So it brings together suppliers, customers, partners, and stakeholders. And relationships between all that group improve as joint risk sharing happens, as communication about the risks improve. And this whole process also increases trust between suppliers, customers, partners, and stakeholders. Next slide, please, Stacy. So I want to talk about supply chain risk as a two-sided coin, right? Generally, we only think about risk as a negative side. We have risk events or prevented, mitigated, handled, try and minimize the damage and recover, and then we move on. But there's also the positive side, and that's opportunities. So a risk event happens, we deal with it, then we get positive gains with our partners, our stakeholders, our customers, because of our preparation, our swift response, and our smooth recovery. So opportunities are the possibility that an event's can occur and positively affect the achievement of our objectives. And that supports value creation or preservation. So next slide, please. Now let's get to the meat of this. What is a mature supply chain risk organization look like? We want to look at a framework that's going to protect your company and your brand and allow you to seek your greatest reward. In other words, to accomplish your mission because you've minimized the exposure to supply chain risk. So let's look at the first component. Next slide, please, Stacy. So the internal environment, that encompasses the tone of an organization, and it sets a basis for how risk is viewed and addressed, right? So that includes what is the risk management philosophy and what's the organization's risk appetite? What are the integrity and ethical values? And what's the environment in which they operate? That's called governance. Next slide, please. So objectives have to exist before management can identify potential events that can affect their achievement. So enterprise risk management ensures that management has in place a process to set objectives and that those objectives support and align with the entity's mission and that they're also consistent with its risk appetite. Essentially, we have to insert risk management into the business strategy process because risk and business strategy are tied together. If the strategy changes, risks are probably going to change. If risk or the risk environment changes, that's going to affect the accomplishment of your missions and your goals. So this underscores the need for constant awareness and vigilance. And having risks tied to business strategy makes it easier to leverage those risk events to the accomplishment of the mission. Next slide, please. So once we've done that, linked risks with the business mission, then we map the entire supply chain. We've got to understand all the interdependencies, and we've got to go from our suppliers' suppliers to our customers' customers. You've got to identify failure points, and there's many tools to do that. There's geographic mapping, and there's many companies who do that. There's a process called SCORE, which is a business process reference framework, and that is used to describe supply chains, benchmark best practices, and compare performance to the best performing companies. That process of using that and benchmarking shows weaknesses and vulnerabilities that you can then work on and improve and shore up. There's also supply chain networks. That's basically you link with all the suppliers and sub-tier suppliers, and you have better information and visibility as far as inventory and lead times. There's also artificial intelligence that processes the data, right, and can show early warning signals. Okay, next slide, please. Once you map the supply chain, then you identify events, right? And there's internal and external events. They've got to be identified and distinguished between risks and opportunities. So you create a risk register similar to like what project management does. And you also do this for the opportunities. You do that for risks and opportunities. At the micro level, that's internal risk. Those are things like quality, counterfeit items, security breaches, capacity issues, company culture. Then on the macro level, that's external risk, things like recession, pandemic, weather, politics, war. So some approaches to identify risk. One of the most effective is to have better and more frequent communication with customers and suppliers. So think about that healthcare supplier training in January. They were checking with their suppliers, and that's how they discovered a shortage of masks in China. That's part of the supply chain sensing and early warning. There's also supply chain risk mapping, like we talked about. There's different kinds of analysis. There's third-party research and marketplace intelligence. There's also intuition or management insight. And there's hazard and operability studies. Next slide, please, Stacy. So once we've identified, then we go about assessing. Risks are analyzed, and we got to consider the likelihood and the impact as a basis for determining how they're going to be managed. you do that so you can rank the risks for prioritizing and see what's most important and most urgent to look at. Other tools to do that is value at risk, time to recovery, different statistical process tools. You can also use supply chain risk rating services. Next slide, please, Stacy. Then we create a portfolio, and management is going to develop a set of actions to align the risks with the entity's risk tolerance and appetite. For each risk that's identified, you develop a specific plan of action, and you can prevent and avoid, or you can accept the risk with actions to try and minimize the damage, manage it, and isolate the effects of it. You can try and transfer or share the risk. You can mitigate, or in other words, reduce the likelihood of the impact. That's kind of like putting up bumper pads. You can put in redundancies in your processes, in your resources, in your suppliers. Then there's recovery, and don't forget to capture relevant information so we can analyze, evaluate, and improve that. Next slide, please. Then we coordinate with our partners. Identify the stakeholders, get them on board, create risk awareness throughout the entire supply chain. Again, from suppliers through customers, and decide how to share all those risks and decide how recovery is going to happen. Next slide, please. Then you detail and get agreement on event and response information capture and communication. The relevant information is identified, captured, and communicated, and it's got to be done in a form and a time frame that enables people to carry out their responsibilities, right? And the effective communication flows down, flows across, and up the entity so that everybody's informed, everybody's involved, and has the right information. Then the entirety of the enterprise risk management process and system is monitored, and then modifications are made as necessary. Monitoring is accomplished through ongoing management activities, separate evaluations, or some kind of combination. Next slide, please. And next slide, please, Stacy. Then, once all that's in place, it's practice, practice, practice. The purpose of that practice is engagement, education, and discovery of risks. So you simulate a risk occurrence, you measure performance, and evaluate the performance of everybody. You got to probe for weaknesses. You got to see where there's less than optimal responses. And then you also practice damage control. So next slide, please. Just a summary of a mature supply chain risk program. A supply chain risk management center of excellence is implemented, is put in place, and they implement that program. A supply chain risk manager coordinates and drives the effort. The point is to have ongoing dialogue about risk. Risk isn't going to go away. Disruptions are not going away. So we can do better, and we can put plans and systems in place that will help us mitigate, help us be prepared, and have early warning and sensing, and be agile and resilient. So next slide, please. So now what? So what you can do, start out, look at your supply chain, make a list of risks or vulnerabilities, and create a risk register. Make a rough cut, assess for likelihood and impact. That'll help you prioritize. And decide what to focus on. Maybe that's your top 10% of suppliers, your most important. Start looking at options for how to deal with those risks. You're going to transfer it, you're going to prevent it, you're going to mitigate, deal with it, and create a portfolio with response plans for each risk. As you're doing that, look for the opportunities as well. How can you leverage that into opportunities for more business, for better relationships with risk holders, with stakeholders, with suppliers, and with customers. So the goal is to preserve brand and legacy. Remember, the Institute of Supply Management said that 97% of businesses had some kind of supply chain disruption from coronavirus, and 44% had no plan to deal with this. We don't want to be like them. We don't want to be like KFC, who ran out of chicken when something failed in the supply chain. We don't want to run out of PPE and put ourselves and others in danger. We don't want to be a run out of toilet paper story. Remember, supply chain disruptions are linked to national security. In fact, the information we're seeing, the supply chain mess that came from COVID, because of that, cyber events have spiked. So traditional supply chain risk management and national security supply chain risk management are tied together. And Barbara is now going to talk to us more about national security risks.
Okay, good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my my connection here today, but I just want to thank Mark for that great overview, and Amy as well, on the supply chain, and just the idea that it is incredibly important to know all about your supply chain and to have a plan for disruptions. National security risks to the supply chain are a specific type of risk that I think for my presentation, I just wanted to, my goal is to make you aware that it's out there, that there are particular responsibilities of corporations now that are governed by quite a few new regulations. And it's sometimes a difficult aspect. It doesn't always fit into all the categories that Mark was talking about. So for example, the OT, the operational technology and the enterprise technologies, IT, that deliver or potentially deliver disruptions through malwares. That's an obvious one, but there's also quite a bit of risk and national security risk to your basic materials. In order to illustrate this point, I think sometimes it's always good to have a story that you can tell that people will remember, just to illustrate the point of national security supply chain risk. It's kind of a cautionary tale, and I like to tell the story because it starts really at the beginning of my career when I was living in Moscow in the 1980s. So that was Moscow, Russia, not Moscow, Idaho. But anyway, you may have read it in the news at some point, or if you're as old as I am, you might have lived through it. But it has to do with the U.S. Embassy building that was newly constructed on the embassy compound in Moscow. The construction was started in 1979, but by 1985, the construction had to come to a complete and total halt. I arrived in Moscow in 1986, and by that time, we had discovered quite by chance that the new 8-story building we had constructed on the embassy compound was a giant Soviet antenna. In fact, you can read about this in many different publications now after the fact. But most of the construction materials were loaded with Soviet listening devices. I recall the Baltimore Sun later described this as a monument to the ingenuity of the KGB and a constant embarrassing episode for the United States. You see, this happened because in 1979, believe it or not, when the construction began, there was no clear plan for the security of the actual supplies and building materials that were coming to the site. Even inside Russia, the specialists, the US specialists who were called to inspect the materials did not have a very good or clear idea of what they were looking for. And this is really that cautionary tale I was talking about. By the time the construction had stopped, they had already spent $136 million in the half-built building. They spent several more $1 million inspecting the carcass of the building years after to figure out what had happened. And finally, another $240 million were spent after 15 years of taking down brick by brick the old building and putting up a new building in its place. It's really astonishing when I talk about even today what a disaster that was and how much it cost the U.S. taxpayer. So as the epitaph, the U.S. Embassy building was finally opened up in the year 2000. So from 1979 to the year 2000, you have a real poster child example of what can happen when a national security threat from our foreign adversaries disrupt the supply chain of one of our major projects. So as you may have guessed, I really like learning from history. So here are a few snippets of what they found in the US Embassy building in Moscow. And this is according to the NSA manager who was in charge of the investigation program and who later wrote compound that is strictly for Americans. The Russians at the time and the Soviets were not allowed in this area. So when they were trying to figure out, well, how in the world were they going to use this antenna, they sent back 10 tons of equipment from this building, from this construction site, in order to examine it back in the United States. And they had a really hard time trying to figure out why in the world would this antenna be useful to them. Basically, they saw that there were listening devices, but there was no real clear way that that the experts could see that they would be able to get any signals out of our building. So finally, after several years, the big breakthrough was when they found they were examining an IBM Selectric typewriter, which was what they used at the time in the 70s and 80s to write their embassy reports. And of course, we didn't have computers, and it was a much different environment back then. But yes, IBM Selectric typewriters were the main way to document our activities. It led to a discovery of all sorts of modifications to the IBM Selectric typewriter. Interestingly enough, they first found an electric coil inside the return button of the IBM, IBM typewriter. And then a lot of different spaces within the American-made IBM typewriters that they had replaced and modified in order to put transmitters within these typewriters. And basically, they were designed to transmit keystrokes on a low power, narrow frequency that was being self-powered by the typewriters. And that low power frequency hitting the transmitter was never detectable by our scanning equipment because it was on such a low frequency. And then they also were able to hide that frequency by having a powerful nearby TV station that would broadcast above that frequency. So in the end, and if you read this book by Charles Gandy, it's an incredible read, but the engineers were actually, US engineers were quite admiring of the work of the Soviets at the time, the patience that it took for them to develop the system and the attention to detail, which would have been a big payoff for them had the US not discovered their implants. And really, I can tell you, having been there myself at the time, it was really just by sheer luck that we had discovered these penetrations. Indeed, at the time, the people that I worked with, the people that were involved with all of this, looking at the supply chain, we admitted, people understood that the Soviets would probably try to bug our embassy. It's an old spy versus spy assumption, right? But we always assumed that because of the clunky Soviet technologies that we had seen in the past, that we would be able to detect them, and that our detection capabilities were far superior to them. Well, lo and behold, they were not, and frankly, we didn't even really look that hard. So just end that story with a quote from the former CIA director, James Schlesinger, who said about this supply chain debacle that the major culprit is American complacency. The tendency to assume that our adversaries are technically inferior and that we can handle whatever they throw at us is actually a critical error of hubris. So I guess, why do I tell you this story other than I'm a bit of a history buff, and it definitely resonates with me, the kind of cost, frankly, for organizations, for the government, for subcontractors, the cost that it has when we don't have a good supply chain risk management program or plan. So fast forward to 2020, juxtaposing this story, I think it's really important that we know that there's a lot of talk about supply chain risk management. I mean, it's a particular catchphrase now that everyone's talking about, but very few people are actually talking about the potential national security penetrations of the supply chain. So basically right now we have software, as Mark was saying, hardware, enterprise systems, operating systems that are connected by a computer to the enterprise systems. And the best supply chain due diligence can really be done through malware kill chains and various cybersecurity plans. But we can't forget that there's also a national security element to our components and materials. And just as a quick list, Amy has done a wonderful job of summarizing the growth that INL is about to have by building its nuclear test reactors. It includes base mat, concrete, steel, forgings, pumps, valves, piping, instruments. You all, I'm sure, know a lot better than I do about mechanical equipment, reactor trip breakers, piping, cabling, conduits. I wonder if you can ask yourself as a corporation, have you ever thought about how can those materials be modified either to create a penetration inside a sensitive installation, or how could they be modified? Maybe it's just to fail. Maybe the products and materials could be modified to fail. And really, from a national security perspective, all of the good practices that Mark's talking about, when you analyze your business proposition, when you analyze the risk to your cost, to your production of things like the pandemic or other natural disasters, by also really asking yourself, well, what would my foreign adversaries do, and why would they do it to this particular element that goes into a nuclear reactor, a nuclear power plant? How and why would they want to do this? And that first question, I think, is critical to then proceeding with various tests and various due diligence that you can do to understand where your products and materials and your OT and your IT might be vulnerable. So basically, I'd like to also transition to the idea that the federal government, again, like I said, is looking at supply chain risk management very closely. I like to say SCRIM, as we all call it in the government, supply chain risk management, is the new black, because everyone's talking about it. I'm not sure everyone knows how to do it. We're very lucky to have Mark because he has such a good comprehensive grasp of the various steps. And as you can tell from his presentation, you really have to do your homework, and you have to really take into account everything that could happen to your supply chain, including national security. The federal agencies are looking at this too. And you may have a hint of this because it seems that there's a proliferation of federal agency executive orders, policies, and regulations governing this national security aspect of the supply chain. I'd like to talk about a few of those policies and orders right now, just to help you be aware that that they exist if you haven't heard of them before, but also that they're coming to your front door if you are interested in subcontracting to the U.S. government or to sensitive projects on the critical infrastructure in the United States. These federal executive orders and policies will apply to you. The first one I want to mention comes out of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. This is affectionately known as CFIUS. They have existed for quite some time, and they're an established regime which is under the authority of the Department of Treasury. They are in charge of what is basically a review system in order to Risk Review Modernization Act, and they're actually looking not just at major foreign acquisitions or mergers that happen in the United States. They're looking at what they call TID. So TID is technology, infrastructure, and data. That's hugely broadening the responsibilities of CFIUS now, and certainly the technology part is critical technologies that might be sensitive to our country, but also IP and patented information that we don't want people to steal. But then there's also the category of critical infrastructure, and then that interesting category of U.S. national data, U.S. citizens' privacy and national data being stolen. This all could be something that you touch on when you're doing subcontracting for the government. And so I really encourage you to go to the Committee on Foreign Investment and read about its policies, which refer to the supply chain. Another executive order I want to highlight, or an executive order, this is coming out of the White House in January, and it's 13920 if you want to look it up. It's entitled Securing the U.S. Bulk Power System. So this is an executive order which is, I think, pretty unprecedented, but it applies to the utility companies and anybody who's working on the bulk power grid system. And essentially it is requiring that any of these companies not work with or have any components that come from our foreign adversary nations. So I think in this case, the executive order probably instigates more questions than it does answer questions about how do we go forward, how do we become compliant to such an executive order. The good news is it's being administered to by the Department of Energy now, and they're coming up with a regime to help the private sector be in compliance with this requirement. But again, essentially, really where the government is looking is critical infrastructure. That's a really big issue, and certainly something that is in Idaho's supply chain when we're talking about building the new test reactors. Also some of the acts that you should be familiar with, the laws that are out there, is the Title II Secure Technology Act. They have a lot to say about the supply chain and the regulations. That came out in 2018. There's another executive order assessing the strengthening and supplying the supply chain resiliency. Again, something that is in an order. So when Mark is talking about the concept of resiliency, there is a certain amount of government behind that requirement. if you're a corporation now, creating your supply chain risk management department, this is really something to pay attention to. There's also quite a bit of legislation surrounding the national security systems, and this applies to all those out there who are involved in the 5G, the new computer connectivity and software, hardware, talking about the cyber risk that is just going to be exponential as we walk into the real fifth generation age of computing. Another one I draw your attention to is the NIST standards. So this is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They had quite a bit of practices and federal government requirements for supply chain risk. Essentially, that is what I wanted to let you guys in on. I hope my story resonates with you, and I appreciate you all coming.
Thanks, Barb. And Stacy, we'll just wrap it up for the three of us. Thanks again for this great opportunity. We have a lot of work ahead of us in both the security and in the energy world, and having great suppliers that understand some of these complexities, as both you heard from Mark and Barb, it's so important. And as we start really understanding what our gaps are in the supply chain, we really anticipate real good opportunities for our suppliers that we currently have, and maybe new suppliers that we need to bring on. So we're looking forward to being very transparent about what those opportunities are and sharing that very openly through maybe your forum and working with you on these great opportunities for engagement. So I don't think there's much time for questions, as it looks like we've drawn to the end, but I'll let you guide us from here. So.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists for participating today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to visit with us. We will post the video for this session as soon as we get it downloaded, so you can find that on the webinar page. And then next month, we will be talking about fabrication needs at the laboratory. We're going to have one of our contract specialists visit with us, our quality manager, to explain what some of the NQA1 requirements are, and then some of the upcoming fabrication needs that we see coming down the line. So if you're interested in fabrication, you'll want to tune in November, and you can register on our website. So with that, I want to wish everybody a great day. Enjoy yourselves and stay healthy. Thank you.